Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out this evening. I'm going to speak in favor of a convention of states. Okay. Many of you may not know that the Convention of States project is a project from the Citizens for Self-Governance. The Citizens for Self-Governance was born, this project was born independently from Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, but they both are a near perfect match. The plan for the Convention of States does not commit to a particular amendment. It's going to be up to the states when they convene. It does commit to a particular subject, and therein lies the difference to what's happened in the past. The subject matter is going to be limited to the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. The idea for the Convention of States project is to limit the power of the jurisdiction of the federal government. We all know what the problem is. All you have to do is look at the IRS, the NSA, Benghazi, Fast and Furious, EPA edicts, Obamacare debacle, and some of the other scandals. And most recently announced is the FCC that plans on placing people to investigate how media is presented on radio and in newsrooms. It's quite scary what's going to happen. Basically, the problem is that DC is out of control, and I very highly doubt they're going to relinquish any power. What we are seeing is 4 major abuses of power by the federal government. We see the spending and debt crisis. We can see this with the budget. We can see this with the debt limit. We also have a regulatory crisis. All you have to do is look at some of the EPA edicts that go on. Congressional attacks on state sovereignty, and of course the federal takeover of the decision-making process. These abuses are not mere instances of bad policy, but examples of soft tyranny in which the government softens, bends, and guides men's will. Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy of America in 1840, said that if we do nothing to halt these abuses, we run the risk of becoming a flock of timid, industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. Let's take the spending and debt crisis. We all know we're about $17 trillion in debt, notwithstanding unfunded liabilities, which bring it up to a minimum of $50 trillion in debt, if not more. The very fact that we are that level in debt is why we cannot tax our way out of this problem. Even if the federal government confiscated all of your IRA money and other assets, we would not be able to cover the debt. We have a regulatory crisis. The federal bureaucracy has placed tremendous burdens on business. They're both complex, conflicted, they're crushing the private sector. They have little accountability where agencies exist rather than Congress when they enact the substance of law. What I'm trying to say is that Congress is the one that's supposed to enact the laws. When the federal bureaucracy enacts laws, we the people have no recourse at all. Research from the American Enterprise Institute shows that since 1949, federal regulations have lowered the real GDP by 2% and made Americans at least 72% poorer. We have attacks on state sovereignty. For years, Congress uses federal grants to entice the states to do their bidding or to do what they want to do. All you have to do is look at Medicaid expansion and what's going on there. There's a very good example. By attaching mandates to these grants, Congress has turned state legislatures into appendages of the federal government. rather than being the truly independent Republican government that they are supposed to be. So what's the result? The result is we end up with a radical social agenda, and it results in an erosion of the rights of every individual. State legislatures need to be free to implement the will of the voters, not the will of Congress. We have a federal takeover of the decision-making process. An example immediately is the Defense of Marriage Act that we're seeing and what's happened just recently in Virginia. The federal court says, no, unconstitutional, and where are we? The founders believed that the structure of a limited government would provide the greatest protection for liberty. There were supposed to be checks and balances, but collusion among decision makers in Washington, D.C. have basically replaced those checks and balances. It's all about power and money. The federal judiciary supports Congress, that's what we're seeing, and the White House in an ever-escalating attack on the states. I want to stop for a minute and talk about the structure of decision-making. It's the structure. It's who decides what the law shall be. That's even more important than what the law is. Who is supposed to make these decisions? We, the people, are supposed to make the decisions, not Congress telling us what we're supposed to be doing. Protecting liberty requires strict adherence to the principle that power is to be limited and delegated. States have challenged this federal encroachment. I refer you to New York versus the U.S., a 1992 decision, and I can give you the citation later if you want. But the Supreme Court upheld the powers conferred upon the federal government, saying that the Constitution's phrase is phrased in such a language that it's broad enough to allow that expansion. So basically, the Supreme Court says that it's okay for the federal government to expand because the Constitution's language is broad enough to allow that. So unless the citizens intervene, D.C. is going to continue to bankrupt our nation, in my opinion, to embezzle legitimate authority from the states and destroy the liberty of the people. So what does this really mean? First and foremost, the Convention of States is not a partisan issue. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not Libertarian. It matters to all of us because the rule of law is what's important. The process is what's important. And that is what is being eroded right now through the federal government. Washington, D.C., I believe, will never voluntarily relinquish meaningful power, no matter who's elected. I believe that it's the states and the citizens that must be proactive about taking the power back. We're at a crossroads. We have two paths, in my view, to go. One is the status quo. We keep thinking that the federal government is going to redeem itself, that it's going to listen to us, and it is going to relinquish some of that power, and we're going to be okay. It's going to take care of the spending and debt and all of that other stuff. The other path, which is the path I think we need to take, is that of restoring liberty and having another American renaissance by allowing us to use the Convention of the States to push back the federal government. Let me just read you really quick Article 5, or most of Article 5. It's very short. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, not a constitutional convention, a convention for proposing amendments which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions thereof. And that's the important part of Article 5. There's 2 ways to amend the Constitution. I'm a little behind. We all know process 1. We're not talking about this tonight. This is the only way that the Constitution has thus far been amended. And that's where Congress, 2/3 of the Congress have proposed amendments that have been ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the states. We're going to talk tonight about the second process. And that is where 2/3 of the state legislatures call for a convention of the states in which to propose amendments to the Constitution. So let me just stop for just a minute. I want to read you a little story about the Convention of 1787. Because George Mason is the one that's responsible really for giving us, well, he's not the only one that's responsible, but he was a major architect. On September 15, when the convention was reviewing all of the revisions, George Mason was concerned because, according to Article 5, only Congress could propose amendments to the Constitution. And he said, no amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive, as he verily believed it would be. In response, Governor Morris and Elbridge Gerry made a motion to amend the article to reintroduce language allowing for the Convention of States to be called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. And so we have them to thank for this option available to us. So this is the process. We need 34 states to submit applications for the same issue. It has to be the same subject. And I'll show you at the end, towards the end of the talk, what the structured application is, because it's extremely important that the language be the same. If the language is not the same, then the state applications cannot be quote-unquote aggregated or counted as 34. They have to be near identical. And this is the reason, and I'll get into this in a minute, about why it's important that the Convention of States call for a subject matter and not a specific amendment, i.e. a balanced budget amendment. Because what could happen? Congress can pass a balanced budget amendment, and then what do? Well, we got a balanced budget, so let's raise taxes. So that does not do what we're trying to do, and that is to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Okay, 2, Congress is required to call a convention if we get 34 states. They don't have any choice in the matter. They must call the convention. The only thing that they have to do is to set the time and place of the convention. And if they drag their heels, then the states or the courts can take action. They cannot do anything but set the time and date, the time and place of the convention. So what happens? The states will then elect delegates, or what's really called commissioners, to then debate, propose, and vote upon possible amendments that apply to the subject matter. Okay, so this is, so then what happens after that then would be, once all of these things are debated, then it takes a simple majority, thank you, a simple majority to then pass the amendments, and then they are sent back to the 38 states to ratify. If we get 38 states to ratify the amendments coming out of that convention, they become part of the Constitution. The founders knew that the federal government might one day overstep its bounds. They gave us Article 5. It is a peaceful way for us to take the power back away from the federal government and give it back to the states and the people. The reason that the Convention of States this time may be different, here's the big picture. We've got Citizens for Self-Governance that have come up with this application process and this subject matter. They have organized in 42 states so far. They have an organizational structure to help us get this through. And their mission, obviously, is to empower the state legislators to do this, to call a convention, to propose amendments. No current Article 5 proposal has ever been able to reach 34 state applications and thus be able to call a convention of states. And one of the reasons that that is so is because it's never been for a particular subject. It's always been for a specific amendment. And it really has not ever had the grassroots support that it does now. So never has there been enough momentum behind any one amendment, but now we have an opportunity to do that. We are calling a convention of the states for the purpose of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. And we would create a complete package of restraints in this convention that would then go back to be ratified by the states. So, really quick, what would some of the amendments possibly look like? Well, we could have a balanced budget amendment. They could redefine the General Welfare Clause. They could redefine the Commerce Clause. There might be a prohibition about using international treaties to govern the domestic laws of the United States. They might impose term limits for both Congress and the Supreme Court. They could place an upper limit on taxation, or they could require different sunset provisions. There's any number of things that they could propose, but the key here is it all has to be on the same subject matter. So, we have to build a strong network of grassroots support. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we take some advice from George Washington, and we take it with us, and we help it grow our grassroots. George Washington's birthday, by the way, is Saturday. There's a great event about that, but I digress. First of all, Citizens for Self-Governance. Mark Meckler is the president of that organization, and he co-founded the Tea Party Patriots, which is one of the largest Tea Party organizations in the country. Michael Ferris is founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He is also recognized as the leading scholar on Article 5. So here's the plan. We need 3,000 of 4,000 state house districts. We need 3,000 district captains and 100 people underneath them. And in each state that we have a presence, we have these three leadership positions: a state director, legislative, and coalitions director. Let me show you what this looks like. This is what it looks like. Right now in Virginia, we have a state director, a legislative, and a coalitions director. We need more district captains, and we need more volunteers underneath those district captains. I'm not going to bore you with what each one of them does. They all have important things to do. Obviously, district captains will help educate and recruit volunteers to, of course, write letters, go to legislative sessions, talk to legislators, those types of things. Legislators who support a convention of the states must know that we have their backs. Let me stop for just one moment. I've got about 5 minutes left, I think. And I want to talk to you about one of the most common objections to Convention of the States, and that is the doomsday scenario that we'll have a runaway convention. That delegates so elected by the state will disregard the purpose of the convention and rewrite the Constitution and then change the entire system of our government. And what I propose to tell you, after a lot of research, is that the Convention of the States is the safest alternative to preserve our liberty. That fear is exactly what it is. It's a fear. Michael Ferris, if I haven't totally forgotten everything, is a constitutional scholar who has studied the history of our country, the founding, the writing of the Constitution. He basically analyzed the whole history and basically proved that that's just a fear. It did not happen. Our Constitution was legally ratified by all 13 states. And we don't have the time to go into the details today, but if you go to the conventions of the website for the conventions of the state, you can read that article. And oh, there you go. Yeah.
I have copies of it.
Okay, it's here somewhere. Everything's messed up at this point. So that is the biggest reason that people are not in favor of a convention of the states. They're afraid of that runaway convention, and it's just not going to happen. There are 4 precedents I want to talk to you about really quickly. Number 1, there is a clear, strong, single subject precedent that would be declared binding in the event of a court challenge. There's over 400 applications from state legislatures for Article 5 conventions in the history of our republic. None have ever been called because of a single subject, but there's a huge amount of historical precedent that limits interstate conventions to a particular subject. So we have a lot of precedent in our history since the founding that we can rely on to show us exactly how it's going to happen. Number 2, ratification of any proposed amendment requires 38 states to ratify. It only takes 13 states to vote no on any amendment. So in case there would be a rogue amendment that would be totally off base, we only need 13 states to say no. So bottom line is, it's effectively a chance of 0 of that happening. Number 3, improper changes to the process can be legally challenged by the state legislatures, i.e., the states call for a convention of the states, and all of a sudden, somebody is not paying attention to what the state sent them there for. They're doing all kinds of things they shouldn't be doing. We have a lot of precedent in our history that shows that that would never be upheld legally. The Supreme Court held in Idaho versus Freeman, and that was in 1981, that Congress acted unconstitutionally when it changed the rules of the process midstream. So right there, we've got Supreme Court precedent showing us that they will upheld the rules, and we don't have that danger that the rules could be changed midstream. And number 4, there's no history precedent for a runaway convention. And you can access the article on the Convention of States website and read that, and you can do additional research on your own. But according to this scholar, Michael Ferris, many opponents of a Convention of the States make the historically false allegation that our Constitution was adopted as the result of an illegal runaway convention, and it just was not. It's unsupported. The truth is that the new process that was adopted by the truth is that the new process for adopting the Constitution at that time was unanimously approved by both the Congress and the 13 states as required by the Articles of Confederation. In summary, There are multiple lines of defense against an amendment that might go rogue in a convention of states. And I think that this is one of our best hopes for getting back on track. We have two choices. Do we allow the federal government to continue to abuse the Constitution and sit here and beg our legislators to please see the light and amend their ways? Or do we use the Convention of States process to take it back for ourselves? What are you going to do? At the end of the day, we must trust either the Congress or the states. And I believe a convention of the states is the safest path to self-government and individual liberty, as opposed to succession, which could be violent, or the other one, what was the other one? Nullification, which could also be violent. Thank you very much for your time and attention.